Now it's your turn to call us on the Fox 13 News at noon. Let's turn things over to Kathy.
Thank you, Frank. Coming up, if you have ever thought that we are prescribing too many drugs in this culture for depression, anxiety, attention deficit disorders, you're going to want to stick around to hear the most outspoken critic in America, a psychiatrist who says all these drugs, in his opinion, are doing more harm than good. He believes, in fact, that drugs like Paxil, Prozac, Ritalin, all these psychiatric drugs can cause people to become irritable, manic, even violent or suicidal. If you have taken them or seen a loved one take them and have a reaction, good or bad, give us a call. You're going to hear a man unafraid to challenge the American medical system. The author of Medication Madness is up next.
You're watching Your Turn. If it matters to you, it's important to us.
Millions of Americans are taking mood-altering drugs to treat depression or anxiety. Antidepressants are a multi-million-dollar industry in this country. Many children diagnosed with ADD or ADHD are on Ritalin or other stimulants, and the age at which children are believed to have depression or bipolar or ADD seems to be getting younger and younger. Have you noticed? But recently you may have also noticed some warnings that some people might have the opposite reaction from what was intended, that the drugs themselves might be causing violence or even suicide. Years before these warnings became general knowledge, my guest was sounding the alarm about the dangers of these psychiatric drugs. Dr. Peter Breggin is probably America's most outspoken critic, first with his book Talking Back to Prozac, now his newest book coming out just this week, Medication Madness. Dr. Breggin, you're a psychiatrist and MD, and we welcome you to Your Turn today. Good to have you here.
It's great to be here with you. It
So,
really is.
Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Ritalin, all these drugs that millions of Americans are taking, causing problems.
I think overall they do more harm than good. You're putting junk into the brain. You're putting toxic substances into the brain with the hope you'll have a good outcome. You're actually creating biochemical imbalances. And if you look at the science, it's very hard to show that any psychiatric drugs are useful. The antidepressants, overall, all the studies put together, not useful. No better than a sugar pill. Ritalin for the kids, the stimulants for the kids, it suppresses behavior for a few weeks, and that's about what you can expect, a suppression of behavior for a few weeks. And then, much easier to show are all of the horrendous adverse effects, because they show up in every single study.
Now, so you're telling me that people who say, I feel better taking these drugs, I feel less depressed, I feel less anxious, that they're not really feeling better?
Well, the drugs can cause an emotional anesthesia, so the person may feel less pain, but then they're going to be less effective in figuring their way out of their problems. They may get a temporary euphoria, a bit of a high, in which case their judgment may lead them to do things that are not good for them at all. And often the effects just last a week or two because the brain fights back. The brain says, this is a toxic substance, I'm going to resist it. And that leads to withdrawal problems. All the psychiatric drugs are not only dangerous to start, Kathy, they're dangerous to stop because you can have horrendous adverse effects. There are many people in your listening audience today who can't get off of Paxil and Prozac and the other drugs. The drug companies hid this for a long, long time.
Can't get off because why?
Well, they'll get terrible neurologic reactions, shocky feelings in the head, electrical feelings in the body. They'll crash into terrible feelings of sadness and depression.
So they have to just keep taking them to eliminate the withdrawal symptoms that might accompany.
Some people end up needing to take small amounts for years. I'm talking about 1/10 of what doctors prescribe because their brain can't get over the effects of the drugs.
Okay, in your book, you have taken, I think it's about 50 cases, yes, individual cases, that you studied personally as a psychiatrist, interviewed the family members, interviewed the people, and you believe that in all of these cases, these people who took these medications to get better actually displayed violent, suicidal, erratic behavior because they took the drugs?
Oh, absolutely. The book opens with the story of a very kind, gentle, and spiritual man who saw in a doctor's office that brochure saying maybe he was depressed, so he asked for some Paxil, and it drove him into a state of such severe agitation that he lost his moral control over himself. He wanted to die so desperately to end the pain the drug was causing that he actually drove his car into a policeman, breaking his bones, and after he knocked him down, he wanted to get his gun to shoot himself, but the policeman and a bystander subdued him. And after he was off the drugs, it was like looking back on a nightmare. And this kind of agitation, where you just can't bear to live anymore, is not an uncommon reaction on the psychiatric medications. It is uncommon for it to go so far that a person commits violence. But people also get very high or manic. I've seen people, and again, evaluated their cases. I've looked at the medical records, the criminal records. I've made recommendations to the courts, and often these people get a lesser sentence. On occasion, the court lets them go when they realize that the drugs have done it. But people who have embezzled money in the most bizarre ways, taking money and putting it online on the company's accounts, and then depositing the money in their own savings account, and doing this over a year, and stealing $1 million, which immediately became obvious once anybody looked, even in the most superficial way.
But if these drugs are designed to, by now people know that they are designed to stimulate serotonin in the brain, a chemical that causes happiness and euphoria. If they are taking that medication, why are we hearing that people are committing suicide on these drugs?
Well, it actually fits exactly with the theory, because the idea is that if your serotonin collapses, you're in bad shape. Well, in fact, the brain fights back against the drugs, and you get the opposite of the intended effect. And that opposite effect can even become embedded in the fabric of the brain so that it lasts and lasts and lasts. But basically, if you just look at it clinically, the drugs agitate people, they make them irritable and anxious, give them insomnia, make people more high. And if you do that to somebody who's depressed, you now, instead of just having a sluggish and immobile person who feels terrible and dreadful and is inactive and desperate, and people get very desperate when they're depressed, you now have somebody who's hyper and energized and overflowing with feelings that they can't bear, and then they begin to do harmful and dangerous things.
So how long have you been a psychiatrist?
Well, I'm 72 years old. I've been a psychiatrist for
all your career.
For all my career.
So when you started out, you didn't have this point of view, did you?
Well, I did, but it was different in that the profession hadn't sold out totally to the drug companies. I got started in college as a college volunteer. We showed that kids could get patients out of a state mental hospital. We became a nationally known program for helping patients get out of mental hospitals without using drugs or anything else. The program went on for years. I thought I'd be working as a part of the psychosocial, psychological part of psychiatry. But in the early 70s, psychiatry sold out completely to the drug companies. The drug companies support our journals, they support our conferences, they support our research, they support individual professors.
Let me take a break right here. A good place to take a break. Dr. Peter Breggin coming right back, Medication Madness, and we'll talk about kids on Ritalin and all these drugs. We'll talk about, is there depression? We will talk about Tom Cruise and Brooke Shields. We have a lot to talk about when we come back.